Hello, and welcome to another fully live Friday episode of Hacking with Friends. My name is Kody Kinsey. I am a security researcher at Varonis, and per usual, we have my good friend and fellow hacker, Alex Lin, on the show to talk about the security news of the week. So we've had a pretty busy week here, and lots of news has also happened around like NVIDIA drivers and some other really interesting things with unfortunately big IP. So we're going to jump into those in just a second. But first, Alex, what have you been working on this week?
Oh my gosh, a lot. So we've had our hands full with Nugget development mostly. We're still hoping to launch our product this Monday, I believe, on Hack5. So I've been making sure that our latest firmware is up to date for the Rubber Nugget. I've been also helping with some documentation stuff like creating a static site generator, so we have infrastructure to host proper documentation pages for this project, as well as also releasing a video on Hack5. So if you guys haven't seen that, it was actually a response to the video I did last week, but from a different perspective. So some of you guys were requesting to see more security or blue team related content on the Hack5 channel. So last week I created a video on how to use the Wi-Fi pineapple to run Karma Wi-Fi attacks. But this week I showed how you could actually defend against those using just some common tools like Python and Aircrack in order to not only detect but prevent these attacks from being run. And the basic way this works is this attack will detect Karma attacks based off the presence of a device that's emulating multiple SSIDs or networks from a single hardware address, and then preemptively send out deauthentication packets to basically prevent victim devices from connecting to one of these malicious access points.
So it not only like alerts, but it also like actually prevents different devices from being able to fall victim to this, even if it's not a device that you're in direct control of.
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of primitive form of like a network intrusion detection type thing / prevention. But it was pretty effective.
Yeah, so we did get some requests last week, or actually no, it was earlier this week, to do more blue team stuff. They're like, you guys usually do things from an attacker perspective, but if I'm somebody who is trying to defend, then what exactly can I do? So this is one thing you can do to just see if there's a Wi-Fi pineapple running in a default configuration. But of course, there were some really good comments on this video that were asking questions like, hey, if the Wi-Fi pineapple just changed its MAC address every time it put out one of these new SSIDs, then would this still work? Alex, would it work?
Kind of, sort of. That particular application that I demonstrated uses a static detection method, I guess you could call it. It looks for a single MAC address that's emitting multiple SSIDs. But there are methods that can be used to still detect and profile this sort of activity. Like, for example, the way a Karma attack works is it will basically look for probe requests from your devices and then just generate a network in response. So one solution that I proposed somewhere towards the end of my video was just creating pseudo-random network names or just names that are ridiculous and see if those networks start to be created in response. And you can pretty much use that to determine if there's a device that's automatically creating these rogue access points. And that's just one method.
Oh, right. Okay. So then the way that would work is like you create like a ridiculous access point name, and then in response, if you see it just being created out of nowhere, you know that, okay, someone's listening for a probe request and it's just creating whatever kind of network they see.
Yeah, basically. Yeah,
Spooky.
So you guys can go check that video out on the Hack5 page, and it's still...
Oh yeah, over on your screen.
Yeah. Oh, we do have some great questions. Whoop, there's me, if you guys didn't recognize me. What have you been up to this week, Kody?
So totally unrelated to cybersecurity, I was working on a project for a friend who says that they constantly forget when to take medication. So it's a little bit annoying if you have to take medication, you don't remember whether or not you've taken it already. So I made a CircuitPython pill counter, I guess, or like dose logger, I guess would be a more accurate way of doing it over on my screen. And yeah, so if you take a look, it's actually really simple, and all it does is use a CSV library in CircuitPython to create a log every time you press a button, as well as connect to the internet and get a time. This is important because you need to know exactly when you press the button just to log, when the dose happened. So this is just a way that you can use a little bit of CircuitPython, and in this case, a Wi-Fi Nugget, or really any CircuitPython device that has a screen and a button in order to press that button anytime. So it was a fun little adventure in programming on a microcontroller for a very, very simple purpose. And so far, it actually works pretty good. I was very pleased with it. Also, I got to read a little bit of interesting information released by Varonis. Okay, so this piece of news is really cool because social engineering attacks and phishing attacks are super, super common. And people don't realize that there are ways to make it look really, really probable so that even a reasonable person might assume that an attack that they are being sent is actually something legitimate. And one of those is vanity URLs. So vanity URLs are, do you know what that means?
Yeah, they're essentially short form URLs that can usually be subdomains that are just meant to be easy to remember, like something.google.com. Like docs.google.com is a vanity URL.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different cloud providers that have vanity URL for their services. And what that means is, like, if I work at Varonis, which I do, then maybe when I get a Zoom link, it's like, varonis.something.zoom.com. So my company's name is in there, and that allows me to know, like, oh, okay, like in theory, this is a link that is associated with my company. It's with their corporate account through Zoom or Box or Google or whatever. So the problem here that Varonis found is really sneaky. So this is an example of a vanity URL, varonis.example.com/whatever. And a generic version of this would be the app.example.com/s/whatever. So this first one is much more appealing to share with an employee or somebody else who is expecting to receive something that's part of a company or an organization. But the problem is that you can actually swap out a lot of the meat and potatoes of these links and make it look as though it's supposed to be affiliated with a certain group, even though it's not. So let me explain how this works. So actually, if you also want to see a great demo, Tal Peleg actually did a great explanation, and he's actually the one that found this out. So vanity URLs are often used in services like Box. So in this case, you can see that whatever the example is, .box.com is the shared link that we're going to give someone to make them think that, all right, this is officially from whatever this organization is. The problem is, it's possible to swap this out for another company name and have it resolved to the exact same document. So the link still works. So you can go ahead and swap this out and make it look as though the person who's receiving this file is actually getting it from a trusted source. And that, of course, is a problem for any sort of malicious file that might be downloaded to your computer and then do all sorts of bad stuff. So another scenario is public file request URLs. This is something where you can basically create a form and ask for information along with a file. And this could be something that's delivered with a convincing phishing email that says, hey, in order to register for this company event, please put this information so that, your company can get you hotel rooms or flights or whatever. There's lots of different ways you can make a phishing attack based on this. And the problem is it would look as though the Box account this is coming from your company or from your organization, but in reality, it's a vanity URL, which has just been swapped. And this is such a simple technique. It can be applied across a variety of different cloud services, like Zoom recordings. So you can sign up in Zoom for a vanity URL as well. So that means you could technically create a meeting, send it with a phishing email, and then have that link look really, really legit. And when people sign up for it, you can either record that meeting or if you were to hit continue on this, have an entire meeting that's just being recorded by an adversary. So the Zoom webinar registration was also an interesting and novel way of presenting this attack, because it shows that if you were to create a Zoom webinar registration URL that requires a file or something else to be submitted, it would be really, really difficult for the victim to know that this wasn't coming from a legitimate source. So Google Forms is apparently also something that has a problem with this. This is really across a lot of different cloud services with these URLs, because really the vanity part is not something that the service on the back end, the server, is really looking at. It's instead looking at the rest of the URL. So that allows some swapping here that from a social engineering perspective is really, really valuable. So there's 6 separate examples of how this could be a problem. So if you want to check this out more, I really like this write-up on URL spoofing, because it shows how a lot of these cloud services that offer these third-party services that are used all over the place by lots of organizations might be vulnerable to having some of these sharing links or interactivity links be hijacked and make it look as though a malicious link is actually coming from within the company. So yeah, I open these sorts of links all the time. I'll get like a meeting invite or something else, and generally I'll check to make sure the link includes the subdomain of the organization I'm part of or the organization that I'm expecting. And this sort of deception makes it possible for attackers to get around this sort of just quick visual inspection, and it makes it difficult for them to know whether or not something's really coming from their organization that's using this third-party service. So really incredible research. I was blown away by how effective this is and the fact that it actually still works across a lot of different cloud providers. Varonis reached out also to all these different providers and let them know about the issue. Most of them fixed it. A lot of them have not. So if you're a security researcher, check this out, because it is really interesting how these can be used in social engineering attacks, and so many companies interact with these services. It's inevitable that some attacker is probably going to try a phishing campaign or social engineering campaign that uses these sorts of, I guess, deceptive tactics.
Yeah, I never realized that those vanity URLs or subdomains didn't really mean anything.
Yeah,
yeah.
Most people assumed there
yeah.
was authentication or it was red.
Yeah.
Nope.
Nice. Well, speaking of getting duped, the first piece that I have is about an interesting ploy where cryptocurrency, the lure of using cryptocurrency has duped many people into giving away their money. And this new ruse is a whole new double your money type scam where people are just using old videos of Elon Musk or other popular influencers to trick people into giving their money away, or rather their fake virtual cryptocurrency money, to these websites with the intent of getting double their money back. So apparently these sites have made over like $400,000 in the course of like 7 hours or some ridiculous numbers like that. But it's a fairly simple trick. And you can see these sites also are hosting some fake addresses that look enticing here, but apparently these are just generated in JavaScript to dupe people into thinking this is a legitimate service or thing that's going on. So I thought this was ridiculous, but basically what they're doing is just recycling old content of Papa Elon here and various other high-profile crypto nerds in order to trick people into giving away their money.
Wow.
To these scammers.
So this is just the classic, like, send me some Bitcoin and I'll send you back double?
Yeah, precisely.
I cannot believe that the social engineering attack still works.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And we're also seeing this pop up across multiple different platforms. There's different YouTube channels that are just like recycling this exact same content. They're creating like new URLs every time they're putting this up and quickly like taking them down after. Yeah, and it's just a recurring thing that's a problem. I think the biggest problem here, though, is the fact that people are still falling for this, but it's an interesting case of social engineering and a demonstration of what sort of dumb stuff people might fall for if it looks real enough.
All right, so over on my, I still hate that so much. So over on my screen, Alex and I were having a conversation about different payloads that use Ducky script that would only be possible on a Wi-Fi connected Ducky script-like device. So in this case, that being the Wi-Fi Nugget, we set out to create something that could only really run on the Wi-Fi Nugget and wouldn't be that useful if you were using just like a USB rubber ducky. Now, the thing here is, as soon as you plug in this human interface device attack device, then you're able to connect to it over Wi-Fi and be able to send it commands in real time. But that's not very useful if you can't see what's going on the screen. So in order to make this more of a remote attack tool, I wanted to just start a screen sharing session, which is often less locked down than things like a full interactive session, like just total remote control of the computer, because you already have the ability to connect to the Nugget and make it do pretty much whatever you want in terms of executing Ducky script. So just having a screen sharing session seems like kind of the lowest common denominator. So I was able to use a Jitsi Meet session, which is a open source conferencing tool, to create a screen sharing session in less than 20 seconds on Firefox. And I also made a version, I believe I made a version, yeah, for Chrome as well. So how this works is you plug it into a computer, you trigger the payload, and it will automatically open up a browser and start sharing the screen. And then at that point, you can connect to the Nugget and just start executing whatever code you want and see the result in real time. So it's like you're sitting behind the computer, and you don't really need to know what you want to do in advance. You can kind of figure it out from what you see on the computer. Now, normally you have to know, exactly what you're going after. Because if there's an unknown variable that happens, it can totally derail your Ducky script. But in this case, by establishing a remote connection early on, you're able to be flexible with the payload. And yeah, I think this is really cool. So if you want to check it out, I put it on GitHub. It works probably on OMG devices as well. Because OMG cables and the OMG plug, I believe, allow you to connect remotely and then execute Ducky script. So this payload would be very useful for them. But if you just have a USB rubber Ducky, it's not gonna, you'll be able to see, the screen for a minute, but that's not actually very helpful because you can't execute any commands. So fun little payload that I was working on. And if you want to try it out, you can feel free to do so.
What I like about this one is it doesn't require like lower level interaction like a VNC would, because I've thought about payloads like installing a VNC thing that gives you full remote control where you can like access their keyboard and mouse live like that. But the thing with most browsers is now we have the ability to just like screen share straight from them, which I think was really novel, and I didn't really think of that.
Yeah,
and it's not really easy to detect either. It's just screen sharing. It's not interacting with any of the hardware like kernels or stuff like that.
Yeah, and honestly, installing a VNC is not fun, even if you know what you're doing across like various different operating systems and configurations. So my thought was, if you want to get to being able to see someone's screen as quickly as possible, then opening up a browser and sharing the screen is, it's what we're doing right now in order to share my screen.
It's basically just living off the land. Almost everyone will have a browser.
Exactly, and because you can select which browser that person has as soon as you plug it in and just press the button, then this can try it out on a couple different browsers if the first one doesn't work. Now, Firefox actually has built-in protection, but it's also super easy to just disable it and doesn't require any mouse clicks. So yeah, this is actually super, super easy to do.
Nice.
All right, so moving on to my favorite story of the week, Clearview AI. Do you remember what they do?
Oh gosh, yeah. They sell data that they profile on people's faces based off stuff they scrape on the internet, so from your social media or other places, and they use that to, and they also sell this data to people that are trying to pull up like criminal charges against you or stuff like that.
So technically what they do is they allow for recognition of blurry or otherwise unclear images. So if you have like a surveillance image or something like that where it's not good enough for a traditional identification, what Clearview AI purports to do is gather information on every person in the world and compare multiple different angles and all these other things to let them calculate a value that lets them identify that person in unclear imagery, is basically what they do. Now, of course, that's being used for all sorts of nefarious things, such as bringing charges against people based on identification that may or may not actually work, and definitely doesn't have the consent of people that are being forcibly enrolled in this facial identification program. And that obviously has a lot of people upset because it's very hard to change your face. And as a biometric identifier, a lot of people don't like the fact that some company is making tons of money off of selling identification information that they maybe posted on MySpace or LiveJournal years ago. So the fact that this company has gone back and profiled people so extensively has caused real issues, because while they purport to be able to do these identifications, there's not very many ramifications for them when they get it wrong. And that has made it an issue for people that are the victims of misidentification from tools like this, trying to seek recourse and then finding out that there's not a lot they can do. So this technology is not ready to be used in law enforcement because there doesn't really exist the ability to be accountable for it, since it's a private company and the people who were enrolled in this did not consent. And finally, they ran across some issues with a law in Illinois which prevented them from legally selling their products, and yet they continued to do so. So somebody, the ACLU actually brought a case against them, and they are now permanently banned nationwide from making their FacePrint database available to most businesses and other private actors. Now, this isn't a complete ban because they can still work with governments, but they are being restricted in the ways that they are allowed to market this. For example, in the past, they were allowed to approach individual police officers without telling their department and offer them free trials of this service, which they could then try to use to make a case over. And that presents a problem because the other officers working with them and above them have no idea that they have access to this potentially inaccurate tool that's guiding their investigation. And it also is a very sneaky way of doing marketing when it actually could affect the identification of suspects that maybe misidentifies people or has other ramifications. So the fact that they have been banned from this now also means that they are legally required to provide an opt-out mechanism, something which has never been available to people before that have been swept up in this kind of universal surveillance. So keep Clearview AI in mind when we go through some of the other stories today, because if you add the ability to instantly recognize people from even partial visible faces or other sorts of things you wouldn't be able to recognize people from without this sort of technology, you get a pretty scary scenario where things like autonomous cars are able to identify people and then subsequently be used by police as evidence. So yeah, I'm personally very happy that they're no longer able to sell these to things like, grocery stores, department stores and stuff that could be using the information to track your movements. And I'm also happy that at least in the state of Illinois, they're not allowed to work with any of the state or local agencies for a period of 1 year. If you live in Chicago or anywhere else in Illinois, then you're also eligible to be unenrolled from their horrible service. So if you want to do that, then you can go to this opt-out request form. And they have also been banned from processing the information submitted to this in any way, shape, or form. So if you're submitting your face to be removed from your database, they can't use it to actually put it right back in. So
I was wondering, I was like, how do they confirm that it's you? And then also, what are they going to do with that photo that you upload?
Yeah, so if left to their own devices, they would probably have made this process a nightmare. But because it is compelled by them losing a court case, it is actually fairly straightforward to do so and does not require that much information to remove yourself from the database. So if you live in the state of Illinois or are sometimes in the state of Illinois, or if you've ever been in the state of Illinois, maybe it's time to remove your face from Clearview AI. And I highly encourage you to go back and read some of the details about this case as well, because some of the stuff they were doing was very sneaky and not very ethical. So yes, this is a major case. I'm personally very, very happy that they lost this case and grateful that the ACLU was fighting on behalf of people that have been enrolled in this facial recognition program that's been sold to all sorts of people all over the world without much oversight. So awesome. All right, so also the joyride's over, everyone. Twitter's new terms of service forbid reverse engineering. That means
so that's going to do a whole lot to stop.
That's right. That means that Twitter's security problems are over because it's now not allowed to tinker with it and try to find problems. So yeah, you agree that you will not work around any technical limitations in the software provided to you as part of Okay, sure, Twitter.
I pinky promised.
Yeah, we'll see how that works out. But still, Twitter recently got rid of a lot of its security people that had much better relationships with the InfoSec community. So seeing them now take some of these InfoSec like unfriendly practices is just making a lot of security researchers laugh and be like, well, that's not going to go well for them. We'll see how that works. Making crime illegal traditionally has been a great deterrent. So we'll see what happens. And then we like to go over tools that are useful, interesting, and you probably wouldn't expect me to say Aircrack-NG, but after 2 years, they've actually upgraded it with a lot of different new features. So if you want to check it out, some of the blog post changes were specifically around just improvements, problems in the previous version. Aircrack-NG was broken. There wasn't great 5 gigahertz support. Oh yeah, you had to.
Yeah, I had to cover that for a video, and then it was a major pain.
Yeah, Aircrack-NG was broken due to a package name conflict, which is now fixed. Your pain's over.
Thank God.
Yeah, and now also some of the internal tools like B-Side-NG support and detect all channels in 5 gigahertz on auto channel mode. Previously, you had to select this in order to get it to listen on 5 gigahertz mode. So this is major improvement to a tool that is honestly at the core of lots of different tools that attempt to automate Wi-Fi hacking stuff. In fact, your pineapple detector actually uses Aircrack-NG, so it's probably more stable now, or maybe completely broken if they've changed it too much.
Yeah, it was already somewhat broken because it was based off Python 2, and there was a lot of gross dependencies you had to install, so a bit shaky there.
Yeah, so overall, there are a lot of fixes for Aircrack-NG. If you want to download it, then make sure you get the most recent version, Aircrack-NG 1.7. And this was just released on the 10th, only 3 days ago. So it's still fresh. There's probably, if if you would like to see a video perhaps on some of the new capabilities of Aircrack-NG, please let us know, and we will go through and maybe display some of their 5 gigahertz attack settings and some of the other interesting fixes, and also why you might actually want to run Aircrack-NG now that it's not broken, because I guess prior to 3 days ago, you couldn't.
Nice. Also looks like they detect 6 gigahertz band Wi-Fi channels. That's cool.
Oh, yeah. So,
I don't think we have anything that can detect that, but nice.
Yeah, exactly. So some of these are really focused around the newest technologies in Wi-Fi and being able to interact with them properly. So if you've been frustrated that some of these new Wi-Fi standards have not been able to be messed with, well, guess what? You can mess with them now, which is great.
Yep.
All right, so one thing I wanted to also cover was Immersive View that's coming to Maps. This is something that's based on some really, really cool technology that I wanted to go over because I'm personally a huge nerd for it. So Immersive Maps combines Street View stuff with also all of the satellite footage in order to try to create a model, basically, of reality that you can look through and also use for various applications. So one of the more interesting ones was identifying where you are. And have I showed you live view and how much I like that?
Yeah, I hate it because I get disoriented and I look at my phone and then I walk into stuff. But yeah, you can basically...
How? It's the camera's view.
I'm just like, ooh, this is really cool. And then I'm like, oh, crap.
All right. Well, so live view is something, and I'll go over here, that lets you pull up the camera of your phone and identify where you are by looking for visual identifiers. So the problem is kind of illustrated here. When you're in a city, GPS bounces off of the facades of buildings, and these signals are no longer as accurate as they are in an open area. So if you are trying to get a good location and you're receiving a bunch of bounced GPS signals, it's going to be really difficult for the onboard computer to figure out where you are with any accuracy. And this is a big problem for trying to figure out whether you're going one way or another way when you've got maps open. I don't know if you've ever experienced, like, you'll open maps when you're in a dense city with like big buildings and stuff, and you'll try to start going in a direction and it will have no idea which direction you're going in. That's because the GPS signals are being shredded and scrambled by all the buildings around you, and they're making no sense to the computer that's trying to calculate your exact position. So Google had an interesting idea where they're like, hey, we've been paying these guys to drive around, the country, or I guess the world for, a really long time now. We have all this footage of what stuff looks like. Would it be possible for us to bring up a camera and start using machine learning to visually identify different parts of buildings and other things to exactly determine where I am within this model? So now that they have this kind of immersive model of what cities look like, they can visually identify where you are in seconds. And that is really cool if you are, for example, somewhere you've never been before. So I got to use this in Norway when I was there for the first time and had no idea where I was most of the time. You would be able to just bring up your phone and it would visually identify where you were just by looking around and seeing different things. Now, of course, this is more difficult than it sounds like, because what about trees? Trees change all the time with wind, they change with seasons, and this can make it so that even a relatively accurate position might be completely obfuscated by objects that change. So part of training this model was also figuring out what things change and what things are more permanent, so you can get a location that is not disrupted by, for example, the leaves suddenly changing colors and the machine learning process no longer recognizing it from earlier photos. So this has been a fascinating way of learning about the way that imaging and a camera can be used to pinpoint your location much more precisely than GPS. So if you haven't tried out this feature, it's really, really cool. And I'm interested in the way that it'll be used in the future to do other sorts of augmented reality stuff. As you can see in their demo, it allows you to go to landmarks in Tokyo and ignore them while you fight dragons and their robot companions. So a great way of getting kids to go to famous places and then completely ignore them and instead stare through their screen. I mean, arguably this is much more interesting, I guess, than just looking at this building. But yeah, so one really cool thing is this is being offered as a API. So it's something that developers can access in order to use within applications. And that means that it's much easier to like project things over it, like this dragon, I guess, or also use positioning in order to find out where someone is. So really, really an interesting model of reality that Google has built in order to identify where you are in any possible place in the city just from a couple of images.
That's really cool.
Yeah, slash a little bit creepy. The thought that somebody accessing your phone's camera could identify where you are just as easily as accessing like your GPS location is a little bit spooky. Because just catching a couple frames of a building right next to you would be enough for this API to figure out where you are.
That correlated with like all the other data Google has on you.
Yeah, I mean, of course, of course. But yeah, it's just very strange that now, like, if you just happen to catch like part of a street, that could be enough for this API to identify precisely where you are.
Yeah. It's interesting because we've also seen more analog or, I guess, primitive ways of doing this with like a GPS. I know that was a thing for a while where you could determine the location by also profiling Wi-Fi networks around you or devices around you, and usually those will be tied to like a GPS location or something like that, and you can use that to like trilateralize the location of a device that's within those coordinates or within that bound.
Yeah, so it used to take GPS units like a good like 2 to 5, sometimes 8 minutes to start up because they didn't have the assistance of being able to query for the relative location, which is basically figured out via exactly what you just said.
Right.
Taking all the nearby Wi-Fi networks and then submitting them to an API, and then that API says, based on the signal strengths of these known networks that are in a position that we're aware of, this is where you are. And that's why your GPS, using a GPS or assisted GPS, is able to find your location so precisely, so quickly. So yeah, the ability to then use another factor to identify where you are is pretty crazy, because it's just getting easier and easier to geolocate someone, provided you know a little bit about the surrounding environment, be it wireless or, in this case, visual.
Yeah, it's scary how much different technologies are becoming integrated and how it's able to be used for like position tracking stuff that accurately. I don't have the article pulled up, but I was reading an interesting thing about the new model of like the internet and how everything's going to work with like 5G, and also like how much more accurate positioning is going to become, like even within like warehousing and stuff like that, just because of IoT devices or other small scale devices that are able to very accurately determine their position in space.
All right.
But anyways, for another piece of news, there was a UEFI firmware bug in various HP devices that has been around for quite some time now. This was the original write-up that I saw. This was way back in February. I remember covering this. It was scary. Affecting over 25 different computer vendors. This includes Fujitsu, Intel, AMD, Lenovo, Dell, Asus, HP, a whole bunch of other different computer brands, due to a flaw within BIOS / the UEFI firmware. So as far as we know, it looks like HP has released BIOS updates fixing these high severity vulnerabilities, affecting various products where this vulnerability is present. So that's a good thing, but this was a pretty nasty bug, since essentially it would give attackers the ability to access and modify the BIOS program, which means they can plant persistent malware that exists at a level that's even below the operating system. So in order to remove it, you would need something like a special type of chip to like interact with the BIOS chip, and you can't really like erase it directly from the operating system. But you can see kernel-like privileges are the highest rights in Windows, and this vulnerability allows the attacker to execute any command at the kernel level, including manipulating drivers and accessing the BIOS. So the vulnerability here was that essentially the attacker could call or invoke the system management mode in Windows via the operating system environment, and then use this to overwrite various functions and plant malware inside of the BIOS loader. So that's real bad. But luckily, HP implemented a fix for this, and while they do say it's kind of hard to sort of take advantage of this vulnerability, it's still a possibility, and you should definitely update your devices in that case.
Yeah, BIOS level stuff is always bad.
Yeah, especially since it just like sits there. You might not even know if it's present, since it exists on a level that's like below your operating system.
All right, so over on my screen, I'll cover this one relatively quickly. Do you like NFT mystery boxes?
God, I hate
well,
everything
your
about that.
thirst for mystery boxes could be your downfall, because there is now Redline malware that is making it really, really easy for people who are trying to use bots to get early access to this to inadvertently be infected. So the whole plan starts with YouTube videos. Binance NFT mystery box, and this appeals to cheaters, to people who want to get ahead of the line and also lazy cheaters, people who don't know how to cheat themselves. They just want to be able to use like a free YouTube tutorial to just get ahead of the line and not have to do anything themselves. Oh, and how convenient. These all link to a file that is a binary, so it is impossible for a beginner to really look through this and figure out what it does anyway. So these YouTube videos all link to a post that allows you to get it from get this supposed bot from a GitHub repository. And when you download it, it again just has this .exe file, which doesn't really have a lot of information about what's going to happen. So the readme.txt says unzip the archive, start the bot, install the whatever this is library, start using. Good luck.
You'll really need that. Good luck.
Yeah, and in this case, what it then does is it just steals all of your stuff. So obviously this is something you do not want to do. If you were considering following a free YouTube tutorial on how to get a, what was it? I already forgot. Oh, Binance NFT mystery box. Then you should reconsider. Or honestly, if you're following any YouTube video that says, hey, try this executable on this computer to get something unaccountable. And also that video doesn't have very many views and it's from an account that just started. Maybe don't do that because it is not going to help you get any NFT mystery boxes. It's just going to steal all the ones you already have.
Sad and disappointing.
All right, so do you remember how I just said that Clearview AI was being used all over the place to identify grainy images coming from all sorts of different places, including like Ring doorbells? Well, guess what? Now cars can be added to that list because driverless cars are essentially surveillance platforms. They have cameras everywhere and they're constantly recording for accountability issues. But of course that means a new data source for police to request information from, and this is being put out in training information given to officers who are interacting with driverless cars. Now that might seem like it makes sense, but imagine if every vehicle driving around is a surveillance vehicle and also can scan and potentially misidentify your face and accuse you of being in an area which you were not, and then would have to prove that you weren't. Obviously, this is not great information for people that don't like being surveilled by any passing vehicle, because right now, while somebody might have a dash cam, it's probably not connected to a giant central database that knows exactly where the car was at all times and can be easily requested, possibly without a warrant. So this new surveillance platform means that you don't just have to worry about Ring doorbells recording your conversation as you walk by, you also need to worry about potentially one of these autonomous cars recording your conversation or your face or your location, and then basically having that information being put into a database that's easy to access and totally unclear as to who is going to use it, because that information could also be sold, marketed, and kind of de-anonymized in various ways to track people's individual movements. So yeah, maybe keep wearing masks. Maybe that's the solution, is we're just doing mask time forever, because now any driverless car could be a platform that's being combined into a surveillance tool that allows for easy searching of where people were at any particular time.
Yeah, I don't really trust things that have cameras and sentience, but especially when it's like a thing that has like a lot of momentum that can probably destroy a human body. Or most definitely can. Those things are scary.
Yes. Also, police cars were being used by San Francisco already to do autonomous license plate recognition. So this means that there's a record of everybody's license plate all the time. And guess what? Autonomous cars are just one layer of processing away from being automated license plate readers. Isn't that weird? So if you were just to start processing this information, then weird, you would just have a network of surveillance vehicles that's always recording the location of every vehicle in an easily searchable database. Interesting. I wonder if anyone's thought of this. So these sorts of vehicles roaming the streets and collecting information means that you basically can never lie about your location ever again, because if you're in a vehicle, its license plate could be recorded and your face could be recorded, as well as if you're walking around. So basically, if you're out in public, any random object is now becoming capable of logging where you were and becoming searchable potentially without a warrant. So all of that is alarming and unpleasant, and yeah, just a lot of surveillance news. So sorry to note that, but it is at least nice that Clearview got in trouble, so they won't be able to sell to private businesses and make an easily convertible way of taking these sorts of data sources and turning them into, you know, human faces that can be tagged and identified.
Oh gosh, yeah, we've also seen where, I forgot what system it was you were telling me about, but they're able to detect like who's in your car at like what point in time by also identifying and like mapping faces and
Palantir co-traveler program. Yeah,
I really
yes.
don't like that one.
Yeah, so being able to map relationships between people, basically see who's traveling with who, is also an outshoot of this sort of surveillance. So yeah, if you like keeping your relationships private, good luck. Because if an autonomous car drives by and catches you in the car with someone you shouldn't be, then that could be trouble.
Yep.
I can already think of the stalking that could be done with the commercial service that does that. All right, so this is more of a bit of a blip, but Google Chrome updates on Russian devices are now failing, at least on Android devices. And this appears to be somewhat related to Google's pledge to remove paid applications from their Play Store in Russia, starting on, I believe it was May 9th. Actually, I think it started earlier than that, and that's May 9th is when the issue started. So Google Chrome is free, so it should have been exempt. Oh, sorry, it was May 5th that they were going to remove paid apps. But this isn't paid, so it should theoretically not be subjected to any sort of restrictions, but still it was shown that a lot of Russian users were not able to install the Google Chrome update. The list of fixes was not particularly helpful. Stay on the version you're using. Download an APK to install Chrome manually. Actually, that one seems fine. Use a VPN to trick the Play Store into giving them the update. Okay.
Nice.
Or switch to a different browser.
Oh, that's great.
That's just retreat. That's not remediation. That's not doing the trick. All right.
Guess that's just tricking the users.
Yeah, so altogether, this is not like a huge deal, but it is an interesting bug that has been introduced as Google attempts to filter the types of applications that are able to reach Russian users through the Play Store. So another consequence of the war in Ukraine, and definitely something that is making users very upset. All right, and this has come up again. We were talking, I think it was maybe a year ago, about attempting to scan encrypted messages for CSAM material. So this is a legal material that, in theory, you want to be able to get into encrypted messages and make sure that they're not transmitting any of these forbidden files. But the problem always has been that in order to scan encrypted messages, you have to break the encryption or circumvent it in ways which is akin to breaking it, or otherwise opens problems for future surveillance or otherwise undermining the very principles of encryption. So yet again, this is coming up. And obviously, encryption is necessary for all sorts of business processes. It's really a critical part of private communications and resisting surveillance. So the fact that this rears its head every so often is just something to be aware of. I just don't know that it's possible to scan encrypted messages in a way that preserves the integrity of the message being encrypted. But again, this is something that free speech advocates are calling a threat because it makes it so a lot of these platforms that provide confidential services that allow people to, maybe in repressed regions, be able to communicate openly, to also be subject to potential abuses. So yeah, this is never a good policy in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. And it's interesting to see that this keeps coming up over and over after being defeated over and over again.
Yeah, there's always the moral concern of can they use this to scan for other stuff on your phone? But then there's also the concern that, the thing that happened with Apple too is people were discovering that hash collisions were possible. Yeah. So the way their weird convoluted machine learning thing that was profiling images without actually looking at the images, it would generate a special little hash that associates it with a specific type of material. But they were able to use random pictures of dogs or other stuff that also collided with the same hash value. Yeah. So there's lots of problems there. But also it's when you're marketing this thing that's able to scan through encrypted messages under the guise of being for detecting CSAM, then you can pretty much just vilify anyone that's trying to oppose this. Or no, this is for a good purpose. What are you talking about?
Yeah, it makes it a moral outrage debate when it really is something about technology and math. If you're poisoning the math behind encryption, or if you're circumventing it in ways that can easily be used as an end run around that protection, then it just makes a process that's easy to abuse for people who want to get in and break this. Because if you can add one hash, what if you don't like someone's ideology? So you pick another document and then add that to the list. A lot of these agencies that were deciding which of these hashes would be included were extremely unaccountable, and knowing that your computer also can just be this is a bad file, and just upload it and try to tattle on you, and also so frequently be wrong. is something that a lot of people were very uncomfortable with.
Also, it's like, what if someone hates you and they just like send you one of these nasty pictures, or like a whole
And then
bunch
your
of them?
computer, yeah. So there's all sorts of different ways where this could potentially be abused. Like there's and the automated detection mechanism is just another way that that could happen. So spooky. All right, so then this is a really interesting espionage campaign that went on for a good amount of time before it was detected. So this was targeted at a Jordanian diplomat, and these it's suspected that Iranian threat actors were behind this tool, which was extremely sophisticated, and typically these attacks done by this threat actor are not very well publicized because they're extremely sneaky and they're often very successful and have a history of laying low and conducting mostly espionage attacks. So this was a spear phishing attack that, let's see, had a couple really interesting anti-forensic elements that I'd never heard of before. My favorite one in this was checking for the existence of a mouse.
Hey,
So-
I found a mouse in my room the other day.
Yes, you did.
A live one.
I'm not sure that's the same one, though.
Dang.
So what's interesting is that a lot of malware analysis sandbox services will not have a mouse attached because obviously it's running in test and it doesn't need one. So by looking at some of the characteristics of the tools that developers will use to identify or try to let a piece of malware play out and figure out what it does, they were able to make it difficult to analyze using a lot of different techniques. So this is primarily living off the land, and it doesn't really do anything that's particularly like unique or sneaky. Actually, well, it is crafted in a way that's really interesting, but it's not doing things that are totally groundbreaking. It's just very, very sneaky. And this is one of the first kind of analyses of the way that it actually works. So it uses DNS tunneling in order to communicate with a C2 server, which is, again, very sneaky. So primarily, if you want to read through this analysis, it's just a profile of some very, very sneaky malware that has been unable to be detected for a long time and finally now has been brought to light after a pretty thorough analysis. So by Fortinet, which was very cool.
Speaking of sneaky malware, we have this new remote access Trojan or remote access tool called Nerbian RAT, which I think is interesting. But this piece of malware has some pretty sophisticated techniques that it uses in order to evade detection, like being able to hide itself from being reverse engineered in various different ways, like detecting if it's inside a debugging environment, checking if it might be inside of a virtual machine by determining if the hard disk size that's trying to analyze this piece of malware is below 100 gigabytes, which typically if you're using like VMware or some other virtualization software, there's probably not a reason to have a large amount of hard disk space. And also I think that this malware operates completely within memory, so that way it's able to just delete itself after it's running. But basically the way that this works is this piece of malware is a variant of existing malware that's already out there, and it's written in Go, which is a cross-platform language that we're seeing is more and more becoming popular as a language that's used for distributing malware across different platforms, because you can compile binaries that have all of the built-in dependencies, as well as everything just baked into like a single piece of software that you can distribute to various platforms, and it will work across different operating systems. But the way that this remote access tool is being distributed is via this ridiculous email campaign where they're trying to impersonate the World Health Organization. So you can see this pretty legitimate email that's being sent here: protect yourself and those around you, with a list of different conditions for COVID-19, of which I see 2 of them that are misspelled, such as diarrhea. Yeah, so if you're having that, you guys better watch out. But they're using this ridiculous email campaign to spread a COVID-19.doc file, which is just a Microsoft Word file. They're using this to then call a macro that invokes command prompt, which then invokes PowerShell, which then downloads a loader or a stager that starts communicating with a C2 server over SSL. So essentially, and this communication is also handled over SSL. I think I just said that, but whatever. But that means that the data that's being exchanged is encrypted and can't be really sniffed or read. So not only is it good at hiding itself from being analyzed, but it's also doing a pretty good job of covering its tracks and exfiltrating data. So while it is interesting and complex, Bleeping Computer notes that this rat is currently being distributed in low volume email campaigns, so it's not quite a huge threat at the moment. Yeah.
Well, speaking of malicious applications, Trend Micro has identified a new malicious application, and over on my screen you can see that its name is Microsoft Edge.
Oh.
Yeah, so Trend Micro started flagging Microsoft Edge updates as some sort of malicious file, and as a result was taking actions to mitigate it, which were breaking Microsoft Edge. So they have admitted that this was a bug, and they have published some steps on fixing the damage that was probably caused to Microsoft Edge by certain parts of its components being identified as malicious and then quarantined or deleted. So if you had any problems and you're using Trend Micro, and Microsoft Edge, then that is probably what happened, because Trend Micro decided that Microsoft Edge was the enemy. Arguably a logical conclusion. However, it has been rolled back and should no longer persist, so if you accidentally did break your Microsoft Edge, then there is guidance on what to do here.
It's funny seeing those false positives come up every so often
Yeah.
for ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, so also in computer breaking news, a Ukrainian, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for selling thousands of login credentials, which he obtained by using a botnet to crack logins. So this seems pretty old school and not particularly sophisticated, but by using this botnet, he was able to gain access to lots of computers. He was claiming he was getting the login credentials to 2,000 computers every week. And this was from 2017 to 2019. He listed these for sale, including 100 in the Middle District of Florida, which is, I believe, eventually where he was extradited to. So this was identified after analyzing Jabber chats, which is something I haven't heard in such a long time. And I do not know if it has a reputation for like incredible security, but it was interesting to note that after going through I guess his Gmail account, they were able to cross-reference it with a Jabber account, which was being used to talk about all of the crimes and offer up these computers for sale, and that is eventually what ended up causing the problem. Looks like he also earned a total of $82,000, which is not that much for getting that much.
Yeah, it's not worth
in prison.
Yeah, not worth that.
Yeah, so this sounded like a complicated, and not very sophisticated campaign that ended up not netting him very much money, which is very unfortunate for him. All right, and then going through probably my favorite piece of analysis of the week. This is a Linux backdoor that existed for 5 years before being detected, and it's called the BPF door because it uses the Berkeley packet filter to sit in a position so as to listen for a magic password coming in through basically any port and trigger some sort of backdoor based on an attacker sending really any packet to any port, which allows this Berkeley packet filter to read it, which is, I think, every port. So this was interesting also because once discovered, a security researcher was able to get kind of an accounting of how many devices were infected with this by sending a ping that allowed them to specify the return address. So by sending out a ping to all these different servers and finding which ones were responding to this magic password, they were able to determine that, in fact, this was a pretty widespread infection and had been going on for quite some time. So there's not a lot in terms of like custom code here. It's more using features that are built in to be able to sit in a very inconvenient place for defenders to be able to find. So what happens is it kind of like lives in the parsing part right before the firewall and is able to listen for the specific packet values as well as a password, and then set up a routing rule to forward any packet from any connection to a backdoor process. What's cool about this is it doesn't rely on a specific port being open. So you can't just scan the internet and attempt to find how many devices have this backdoor running. It's a passive backdoor that only triggers when it's targeted. So if you're the attacker, then you might have any number of different ports you can send this initiating packet to, and once it gets hit by this, it will create a routing rule that makes it impossible for the firewall to log this as suspicious activity. So I'm a big fan of this backdoor in terms of the way it was built and how sneaky it was. The Berkeley packet filter is a really interesting tool to use because it allows for a lot of sophistication. It's like the regex of like packet filters. It makes it really easy to set particular values that can run in the background and sniff on a level that doesn't allow the firewall to really do much about it. So using the Berkeley packet filters, why again it's called the BPF door. And if you want to read more about it, this is a very long Bleeping Computer article on it. And again, it has some really interesting things besides what I already mentioned that make it a very sneaky and so far almost completely undetectable piece of malicious software. So yeah, now that more is known about it, it's being potentially attributed to a group in China. But again, this is fairly recently that it's been fully kind of uncovered. So learning about the way that this works and trying to uncover all the different things it can do has been an interesting process, to say the least. So yeah, very interesting that this has gone unknown for 5 years and has been relatively widespread.
Yeah, I find it really sneaky. The thing that it does, as far as I know, because I read briefly over it, the BPF or Berkeley, gosh, I'm stumbling. Berkeley packet filter, I think sits on like the data link layer, whereas firewalls will sit on like the network or transport layer. So it's like completely able to bypass that since it just like sniffs for raw data, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah, it really
yeah,
is.
and you can't really, it doesn't open ports, it doesn't communicate over them, it just looks at data that comes in and then looks for that magic word.
Yeah, so it's passive, and you can't detect it unless you hit it with a specific magic password. So yeah, like in terms of creating a very sneaky backdoor that's super difficult to detect, this is really a masterwork for making something that's able to withstand a lot of analysis and people looking for exactly this sort of thing. Yikes.
Yeah, it's real cool.
Did we already talk about NVIDIA?
Oh, no.
All right, let's talk about it. So over on my screen, you can see that NVIDIA has published the source code of its Linux kernel modules, but not for everything. This is only for their newer drivers, and also there are some kind of weird restrictions here that some people that like open source software are not very happy with. And some people have even called this a license hack because of using firmware or signed binaries in order to run some of these features.
Yeah, I think so. Like some of the stuff that was initially like running within higher level parts of the source code, they just moved over to like the closed source part of the firmware, but then just like invoked calls that interacted between what's now the open source software. So it's like the important parts of the functions that you would want to call to interact with these devices on a low level have just been moved over to like an obfuscated part of the firmware that you can't really see. Yeah, but at least like some part of the restriction has been lifted where like people don't really have to like reverse engineer or like guess how to interact with these devices on a hardware level, since there's like more function calls and monitoring for like stuff like the temperature or whatever the heck on these GPUs or NVIDIA devices that are now open. And we're also starting to see contributions to the NVIDIA drivers on like GitHub and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, and the GitHub is right here. So if you want to see it, here they are, Open GPU kernel modules for Linux. You can find them on the GitHub repository here. People, again, are very happy about this. And it also means that, you know, other open source Linux projects are going to get a significant boost in performance because now they have access to a lot more than they had before with just trying to reverse engineer stuff. So that is really cool. Yeah,
for both like AI people, machine learning, and then also I guess people who are trying to do like maybe password cracking or whatever on Linux. Yeah, there's a lot more access to this.
All right, you've got a story?
Yes. Cool. So there's a new credit card skimmer that's becoming more and more popular. And we've seen quite a few of these being deployed, but this one is pretty novel. It's a JavaScript credit card skimmer. Well, I guess most of these web-based skimmers we're seeing being deployed using JavaScript, since this just sits on the client side of things and can be run on their browser internally and used to exfiltrate whatever credentials, or in this case, credit card information, to another server. So this new skimmer is being dubbed the Caramel credit card skimmer by Caramel Corp. But their business model is pretty interesting. They provide a pretty sophisticated web interface for managing this tool, as well as a web portal that the users can use in order to manage the stolen credentials, as well as a quick start guide, and basically like a whole documented process, and also very professional tool for managing these campaigns. But they sell a lifetime access to this tool with upgrades and also documentation and stuff like that for $2,000, which is quite a lot of money, but I presume it has a good return if you're stealing credit cards. But you can see, yeah, this thing is basically as complicated or as well developed as like lots of just products you can buy. You can see there's like this web interface here where you can toggle different obfuscation modes. They even have suggestions for different functions that you can use to evade detection depending on what sort of content management systems you're encountering. You can see you're even able.
Bigger.
Oh yeah, you can see you're even able to toggle, yeah, different obfuscation techniques within the JavaScript. And then it's also noted that the method that they use to exfiltrate this data is pretty novel. It just uses the set interval method in JavaScript, which means that instead of like live exfiltrating this data, it just waits for a certain interval to exfiltrate whatever information it's gathered in certain determined intervals of time. But you can see there's also this pretty well-developed customer panel that they can use in order to manage their campaign.
They have like a graphics design department.
I know, yeah. This is
That's
pretty
what
great.
I don't understand. Like, where are these like threat actors getting like good graphic designer, like evil good graphic designers? Like, yeah, we need to make something for like criminals, and we need to make them feel like it's easy and friendly, but also it's gonna hurt their victims real bad. Can you like get that aesthetic? And someone's just like, got it, and that's what it looks like.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh yeah, really imagine you have a handful of stolen credit cards. Like, what graphic designer made that?
Yeah, it's pretty cool to see how just these like ransomware as a service, or in this case, I guess, credit card skimmers as a service type things, are becoming really developed into like full-fledged products with like, oh, they even offer customer support, which I think is really cool. But yeah, really professional. They have these nice graphics here, everything.
That's shocking.
So that's what I have on that.
All right, so over on my screen, we have a sad story. This is a college in Illinois that was shut down after being around since 1865. And the primary reason, or one of the most serious reasons it was shut down, was a ransomware attack. So the problem, of course, was also the pandemic. Like, that has made it increasingly difficult to operate for a lot of these smaller institutions. But a ransomware attack that shut the entire institution down for 3 months was really the final blow in this case, because it denied them access to everything they needed for admissions. They weren't able to properly get people enrolled. And obviously, a lot of these people, if they weren't able to get confirmation of their enrollment, just went somewhere else. So eventually that led to such a low level of enrollment that they weren't able to continue. So this is one of the first cases I've seen where ransomware managed to knock out a college by making it so difficult for them to operate that they were not financially soluble anymore. Solvent? Yeah. So this is we've seen like hospitals and other sorts of institutions attacked, and they obviously need data to be able to treat patients, but schools also need to be able to admit students, administer grades, and also keep track of who has done what. So if you're someone who went to the school and suddenly all academic record of what you've done and your grades has been erased, that's either terrible or maybe great, depending on how well you're doing in that school. So yeah, this is something that cannot function without critical data, and after that data was taken away, it made it so difficult for the school to operate that it looks like it can't anymore.
Dang.
Yeah. All right, so we've got some Cisco Enterprise NFV infrastructure vulnerabilities, and I'll be short and sweet about this. This is an attacker can escape your container and then get root control of the host. So you should update if you're using Cisco Enterprise NFV infrastructure software, because it means that anybody who can execute this or can execute code within the container, which is supposed to obviously be contained, is instead able to escape the container and take root control of the hypervisor. Obviously something you don't want. In other critical alerts, F5 Big IP, this has been a wiper attack, and that's kind of notable because usually when one of these big proof of concepts drops that is able to be exploited, and we can see it was dropped right here, and you know that things are serious when like a profile with like an anime avatar is dropping a proof of concept on Twitter. That's when you know that that things are getting serious. Also, there's like an argument about attribution from like between like this 17-year-old and then this like reverse engineering company dropping like DMs between them. I don't know. I don't care. But anyway, away from the research drama, this has been something that allowed attackers to get to run code as root. And obviously that can lead to reverse shells and other sorts of the more typical things we see of threat actors, like seeding all these vulnerabilities with backdoors and things they can use later once they decide what they want to do. But somebody has been targeting all of these with just the rm-rf /* command, which what does that do?
They don't even care. That just removes everything on your computer.
Yes, it sure does. So SANS was reporting that a couple of their honeypots saw 2 attacks coming from the same IP address that were just trying to completely wipe the computer that was impacted by this bug. So obviously this has been a big deal, not only because it affects so many different companies, but also because people have been running attacks that straight up just wipe the entire system. I also saw some people musing on Twitter that maybe that's not the worst.
Yeah.
Like, is it worse to have, an adversary in your system, like stalking you, exfiltrating your data, and eventually like ransomwaring your most important files, like at the least convenient moment? Or is it better to just have all your files just deleted at a random moment? Who knows? I'm not someone who had their files deleted, so I can't really say. But a lot of security researchers are saying that these sort of wiper attacks are unusual because they don't benefit the hacker in any way, shape, or form. It really is just destroying people's computers because you can.
You just want to be menaces.
Perhaps I'm not trying to lay any blame here, but perhaps a 17-year-old did it. Who knows? But again, like a lot of threat groups are very carefully laying these back doors and trying to make using this like maybe the Linux Berkeley packet filter thing to like establish persistence. But no, someone out there is just erasing stuff to show that it can be done. So it has, I will say, lit a fire beneath people who are needing to update in order to fix this critical vulnerability.
Yeah.
Again, I'm joking. This person did not do it, and good for them for releasing that proof of concept on Twitter. And also, I like their avatar.
Yeah, it's a cool anime. Yeah, but also one of the things that I saw was F5 is also a provider for 48 out of like 50 Fortune 500 companies.
Yes.
So they were extremely scared about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, I can't blame them.
A lot of people cannot rest until this is fixed.
Yeah.
So that is unfortunate. All right. So one of my favorite breakdowns of different malicious applications generally is from Objective-C. Like they put out a lot of really great guides walking through the process of reverse engineering the kinds of viruses and Trojans that you would see on the news, and they explain in detail exactly how it works. So this is by Patrick Wardle, who used to work for the NSA, probably, I don't know, like writing stuff like this. And it's really cool to read through some of these blogs where he'll take something that, is part of a alert about the Lazarus group like attacking blockchain companies in order to get around financial blockades and try to raise money for North Korea. Watching Patrick break down some of these applications that have been backdoored or just straight up malicious. In this case, Eslit is supposed to allow you to watch cryptocurrency prices and also predict what they're going to do in the future, something that is impossible. But on those hopes, it proposes to cryptocurrency users that they install this application, and then all sorts of bad things happen. If you want to read more about this, it is a fascinating attack, and Patrick goes through this in a way that is really, really easy to understand. A lot of this is also based on an Electron app, which allows a lot of reverse engineering because it preserves the underlying, I think it's JavaScript that Electron uses. So this was a very, very illuminating kind of reverse engineering write-up that talks about the way that real threat actors, like nation-state backed threat actors, are attacking real companies involved in the cryptocurrency space. So I really enjoy reading these because I don't know how to do any of the programming in here, but the way that Patrick explains it is just so easy to understand that I always really enjoy these. So we're out of time, but if you want to read probably my favorite write-up of the week, then check out From the DPRK with Love, analyzing a recent North Korean macOS backdoor. Again, like macOS is increasingly a target for these sorts of attacks, and so are cryptocurrency users. We've documented like 3 just in this news stream. So if you've got NFTs or cryptocurrency, clutch them close and don't let North Korea steal them away from you. All right, so that is all the time we have for this week. Thank you to everybody live in the chat, Zam, and everybody else who's been commenting on the various stories. If you have any questions, you can always leave them on the video, and we will make sure to answer them on our Wednesday stream, which hopefully you've seen on the Hack5 channel. And yeah, that's all I got. Also, stay tuned for potentially a launch of our Wi-Fi Nugget product on the Hack5 store on Monday. Just a little sneak peek. And if you already have a Wi-Fi Nugget, we've released many updates for the Rubber Nugget software, so you can check that out on the GitHub repository and check out a lot of the new features and stability updates that Alex has made. So thank you, Alex, for hanging out with us, and thanks to everybody in the chat. We'll see you next time. Bye.